quickly. We started this in about August time, and it had to be done by COP26, right, which was for the end of October. And so we had to set up this sort of digital twin and demonstrate flooding. So the way it worked was that we ended up doing all the graphics without doing any of the proper learning, and then subsequently reverse engineered all the learning. And I was involved in the learning bit, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this. But so what I thought I'd do to start with is just talk a little bit about digital twins and what they are, because people tend not to agree with about what it means, and I'll tell you what I think it means, and how we're using them. And then I'll talk about this CReDo project, which is about this flood risk digital twin that we've been setting up. Now, I must say that this is work in progress. We've done the first tranche of stuff. There's something called a catapult system that we got money for this, which is starting up things, and we're now in negotiations with all the asset owners to try and build proper decision support system out of it. So this is all very embryonic, shall we say. So but what I'll be doing is, what I'm trying to do in this talk is to say that subjective expert judgment stuff is really important, and it's particularly important in AI. And I think, you know, we've had one or two people saying that we really want to look at the intersection between these things. I think Delft is, and people working in areas like you're working, have an amazing amount to give in terms of working with the machine learners, and producing working decision support systems that marry these two areas. There's not enough marrying of this stuff now. So anyway, so I'll start talking about CReDo. I'll then start talking about how you build in these probabilistic models. We built it all around a dynamic Bayes network. And then I'll start talking about how we did some of the elicitation, right? In particular, I'll be focusing on the structural elicitation associated with these things. So the first question is, what is a digital twin? And I've written in this place what, in bullet form, what, as one person has described a digital twin as. It's a virtual representation of a real world object. It's sometimes, it should be, supported by, well, it says machine learning and real-time data. And you always get this sort of nice visual associated with the thing, where you've got, you can see lots of things happening that are sort of trying to emulate what might be happening in the real world. And the basic idea is to use this sort of system for decision support and to discover new things, right? So the first question is, where is the interface between this and probability modeling, and in particular elicitation, right? And the second question is this new? And of course, the answer is no, this isn't new. This is the sort of thing that Simon got me into in the late 80s, right? So this is after Chernobyl. We were definitely doing this. I'm sure other people were doing this. So this must be at least 30 years old, right? It's just that what happens in machine learning, anybody who works with machine learners will know that this is the modus operandi. They find another name for something, and then they publish everything in terms of that other name. And then only about 10 years later, does anybody realize that is the same as something in a different discipline, right? But the point is that because they move so fast, like there's a sort of maximum of ever remembering anything for more than 5 years, that this doesn't matter, right? And so you get this churn of papers that come through about how things link up, and so just here we have a dictionary, right? Representation of real world objects and systems. Well, I would call that a reified statistical model, right? Something that you calibrated to reality, a statistical model. Coupled models, well, Simon and I have been coupling models together and doing the uncertainty handling, didn't we, Simon? I actually saw once Simon cry at a meeting, and I thought, well, why is he crying? And it was because somebody was speaking, saying somebody needs to start doing this, and it's this, right? They were saying you've got to do this, you've got to couple these systems together. He's been, with the road, of course, we did it in Fortran at the time. There's but it was all these things was coupled together. Simon spent 15 years of his life trying to do all this sort of stuff. Anyway. So we do that coupling, right? And also when everything's probabilistic, which you can sort of more, at the time you couldn't actually, it was unrealistic to assume that you could get that, but more and more we're getting situations where you can build up, if things are not probabilistic, then you can get probabilistic emulators of things to couple these things together. As things become more probabilistic, you can start building up a sort of theory associated with how you do this in a coherent way. And this is something I spent quite a lot of time fiddling around with. So that's done, right? Machine learning and refined with real-time data analysis. Well, this is, to me, sort of doing statistical modeling, doing Bayes rule, plugging in the appropriate expert judgments and basing the structure of the thing around what people are saying is going on. Right? So they also bring in the interactive analysis and visualization. Well, of course, within it being a sort of computer-based thing, this is the tail that wags the dog. So it's got to look like a bit like the output of a trendy game. So, and they're very good at doing that, right? So what we did in CReDo actually was we got the front end of this thing looking very, very pretty, and you can see how you could track the effects of this flood through this software, but it was a complete fiction, in the sense that there was no sort of logical link between what was happening in the flooding and what was happening in the interactive, well, the apparently interactive and real time tool that was describing what was going on, right? And the other stuff is decision support. So I'm just saying this is all old hat, right, stuff, but it being old hat is really good because we've sort of learned various things. And I would say there's 3 things you've got to learn when you're doing practice. First thing is that when you're dealing with big systems, you really do need to customize this to what the potential user is going to be using this for, right? I remember going back to the nuclear stuff. I remember with Simon, a vast majority of the work that was done and most of the money went to forecasting very small amounts of radiation, right? And yet we were talking about designing these systems which were to help people, evacuation systems, real-time evacuation systems, to get people away from things. You're not interested in it's sort of technically interested that you can get radiation from amounts that you could get from drinking a cup of coffee, but it's not really very interesting in terms of evacuation procedures. And so we know that we need to customize these things to what you're going to be using this stuff for. And this is sort of countercultural because you sort of want to have something that tells you about everything about everything, and that's always going to be too far away to be able to build in enough time, right? Secondly, what you have to do is you have to ask the people who know about things what's going on in these systems, right? There's no point in actually using what you think might be going on. So it's got to be reified. And this sort of idea of reification is, to me, where subjective expert judgment comes in, right? And also, what you do need to do with anything to do with risk is to somehow talk about uncertainty. So you've got to bring in probabilities in some way or another, right? Now, I know I'm preaching to the converted here, but this is something that oftentimes people who are coming to digital twins new don't realize that we've learned from bitter experience trying to do these things before. We've got to customize, reify, and then deal with the uncertainty. Right, so that's some general points. So what was CReDo? It started in August, September time, and we had the basic problem that we have was the following. There's the thought that climate is changing, that in the next 5 or 10 years, we're going to hit much more extreme weather events, right? And one of the things that it isn't just things that are associated with sea level rise, but the thing that's hitting Britain the worst at the moment is the fact that the climate change is causing many more extremes and more extreme extremes, right? So the water companies and the power companies and the telecommunication companies concerned about flooding want to try and deal with mitigations of what is inevitably going to occur, right? So, and the key thing here is that the impacts of floods produces a network problem, right? So it isn't just the power. It isn't, if you're working for a water company, it isn't just the water company's assets that fail when you've got the flood. It's the power company. If the power goes, the pump doesn't get any power, then you can't use the pump. If your communications go and something goes wrong with the pump, you can't mend it, right? So you have a mutually dependent system that's going along here, right? But what you can also do is you can evocatively represent this thing using a knowledge graph associated with where the assets are and how they're linked, and draw a picture of that, and show how, if you have a flood, how the impacts of that cascade through the system, both with one asset knocking out another, one failure of one asset knocking out another, or and as things move in time, as things get repaired, and so on, how you finally retrieve the system so that you've got a working system. And if you look at there's in the list of things that I've given Tina a copy of this. There's a paper by me and Chris and Kevin, and in there's a website, and you can see from that, you can see this CReDo demonstrator, I think, that we presented in COP26. Sort of illustrating how it could work if you ever calibrated the bloody thing. So this could be really useful, right? So the point is that the basic idea is, if you're either training people in terms of crisis management, or you're working for a particular asset owner, and you're trying to deal with a sort of comprehensive view of various types of floods, right, and working out various what if things that you might do associated with renewing, repositioning, and so on and so forth, the different assets that you have, so it becomes more, they become more robust. This sort of system is going to be, could be really useful, right? But the caveat there, of course, is it's got to say the real, it's got to be real. It's not just going to be a computer game. Right? So now, one of the things I found, I was sort of surprised, was the amount of secrecy that people have on these things. It's sort of obvious once you think about it, but the asset owners are actually really quite careful about, we produced a platform so that they could share with each other various different assets and what their vulnerabilities were and so on and so forth, and where they were and how they were connected. However, they are rather sensitive about malicious attacks associated with these things, and so we have pictures of these things, but it's all sort of made up pictures associated where things are, it doesn't correspond to where things actually are, and entirely anyway, and over we have sort of Google Maps and things, and we place these things on it, and we redo that stuff on that. I can't do any of that anyway, and I'm not going to show you a real-time thing as it's moving through. So I've done my usual picture using a matrix thing with arrows and things in the matrix, but it does represent a sort of the problem associated with doing this in a knowledge graph is non-trivial. Right. First of all, you have these different sorts of assets, but you also have inputs from outside the network which are importing various things like power from other places, not the region that you're concerned with. And of course, the links between these things are very varied, right? The types of ways you're linking these things. And the interesting thing here is that the links are recorded in terms of physical, what they are physically, right? Whereas what you're sort of interested in for inference, of course, is how one thing knocks on from another in terms of what actually happens, right? So you've somehow got to embed in this knowledge graph links that correspond to things that will lead you to help you to appreciate how a failure of one thing knocks on to another. So this is a serious problem associated with this, and I won't minimize it. We're still dealing with some of the issues associated with that. Right, and the information is from different places. You have the structural engineers are very conscientiously collect the vulnerabilities associated with various different sorts of assets, right? So you have a pumping station, or you have a particular type of connector or whatever, and you have various ways in which those could be vulnerable to penetration of water. So people, we've got banks of those. We've done a big audit of those things, and those have been shared across the different companies, or are being shared across the different companies. There's how the assets are linked in terms of their physical linkages, but we, as I say, we need to work out what that means in terms of one thing not working. Does it mean to say the other thing doesn't work? One of the things that tends to get missed is the vulnerability of specific assets on these things. So if you've got a pumping station, the pumping station is somewhere and it's near a river, or it's, so you have particular things that are associated with a particular pumping station and its installation, right? How high various things have been installed in, that sort of thing. Those vulnerabilities are associated with that pumping, not associated with that type of thing, right? So we need to elicit that as well. We're moving along on that thing. They're the defenses associated with the thing, right? Like the barriers that they put up around the thing, or the sheathings of various bits and pieces of electronic equipment, and so on and so forth. Those need to be elicited to know what those are going on. And then once you've got all that sort of stuff, you can start doing some probability elicitation. Right. So what I'm going to be talking about is well, we have this thing. How are we going to model it from a statistical point of view? And we're going to build a dynamic probability model, which tries to be consistent with this digital twin, so that we can sort of do planning for 5 or 10 years hence to try and mitigate some of the risks that are going to be caused by climate change. Right. So here is what we're doing. So how do I build this up? Well, I'm a bit of a one-trick pony, and so I talk about these integrating decision support systems, and people have talked, I've talked an awful lot about this to various people in this audience who are probably bored of me saying this. But the basic thing is the following, that in a system where you're coupling things together, right, then basically the trick is always to try and build something which is a Markov system across these things, where you only include variables that are actually linked to the thing of focus here. That would be failures that lead to loss of service associated with the clients. So you have a joint probability distribution associated with what's going to happen up to time t associated with a given incident, right? And you separate that up across in time, and then the basic thing is to do something like a Bayes net, right, which is build up on the different time slices a sort of relationship between how one thing is going to knock on and have an effect on something else, right? And the point of doing that is that these things here, if we can specify these things, then I can recreate the joint distribution. And if I've got the joint distribution, I can then plug it into the digital twin, and we can see how this stuff is going to be cascading through the system. Right? So that's what we're doing. Right? So here what are we doing here? Well, this is one of the things that we notice here is, in most of these environmental things, it isn't just a Bayes net. You do definitely need to have something dynamic. So here we've used a dynamic Bayes net. And what you have in these systems are absolutely enormous, in fact. The thing that saves us is if we're only interested in a particular region and we're only worried about things that affect whether or not this group of assets is going to fail, and we can focus down on a small number of the variables that help us to forecast that. So what we have in these sorts of situations is you've got lots of different experts, right? So in an IDSS, what you have is it's a bit different from the usual combination of expert judgments, in the sense that you have quite a few people who are knowledgeable about different things here, but they form different clusters, different groups of people that know about climate, or know about weather, right? Or know about warning systems, or know about how assets are affected by just sort of weather conditions, know how crisis centers work. So you have these different groups of people, and they own certain these series, which they have probabilities on, hopefully, and you can then take this sort of system and then get them to deliver. So here we have a climate change. We have various variables associated with the weather which would be interesting to us in this flooding situation. These DTs are the depths of the flood as it goes across the space. And we were sort of in, what are we interested in here? Well, we're certainly interested on the assets getting wet, so things going underwater, assets going underwater. One of the things that we learned about was the fact that to actually do a lot of the stuff to try and protect or restore these failures, you need to have access, right? So these things affect the whether or not you have access to various sites as well, right? If the flood's flooding through over all the roads into a particular area, you're not going to be able to fix something or protect something. So you also need to know how the crisis centers work. What I was surprised was with nobody really introduced the crisis center, and still we started doing these elicitation centers, and then suddenly after about the third one, people say, well, of course you would always set up a crisis center if you had a weather thing like this, and they have very strict rules. They prioritize human life before the assets, and they stop the vans going. So of course we could repair the assets, but unfortunately, well, we won't be allowed to. And you think, why didn't you tell us that before? Right? That completely changes these probabilities. Right? Anyway, so we build this thing up, and here we have, therefore, got this sort of complicated but just Markov thing that you can then use to get the probabilities from. Right? So this is what we were supposed to be. What am I doing? Oh my goodness me! Right. So I'll give myself 3 minutes. So what we had to do was we were put in charge of the model that modeled these assets relative to these inputs. So conditional on how the crisis centers worked and whether we were given access, and the weather, we had to work out what was happening in terms of the assets, right? So one of the things you find with this sort of stuff is as soon as you start building it down, that there are lots of different floods, and there's different models, computer models that are used for flash flooding, for example, or river breaches, bank breaches, or coastal flooding. You just have different bits of software to do that, right? So those things have to be plugged in different ways. Most of the software here is deterministic. That's not what we wanted, right? The flooding people produce this wonderful stuff, which produce lovely graphics, but actually there was no uncertainty associated with these things. And it was also, they would just give you the maximum depth of the flood, right, without any time series thing associated with it. So you would treat two things exchangeably. If you had flood water on an asset for 3 weeks, or if it was like that for 4 days, 4 hours, you just get the same, you get the same output. So what we're doing now is eliciting information from the Met Office about how these things unfold. Also, when you have a flood, you often have storm conditions, right? Well, what happens with the storms is that any external stuff gets hit by lightning, the winds pull down the power lines and things like that. So those happen simultaneously within certain types of incidents. So you're crazy within this network not to consider those things as well. So we've got to build those in to that. Anyway, once we've got that, we're on a bit of a roll, right? Because if we can sort of, for a particular incident we can find a predictive probability distribution of how hour on hour this flood will advance across the system. This F is the failure associated with the particular assets, right? And you've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these assets, right? And within the network, we can use understand how to get to this joint distribution by looking at a particular time slice and see how everything knocks on in terms of the system, and so get a holistic view of what's happening to the network. So that's what we would do. So here we've got a little bit of the Bayes net that we were eliciting associated with these things about how everything moves forward and leads to the failure. And you can see we can begin to break up those failure probabilities and use a credence decomposition that's based on this Bayes net to pull this out in terms of various conditional probability tables associated with the Bayes net, which is what we were doing, right? So we got this. This was a sort of generic thing for assets, any asset, and then we said, well, let's look at a pumping station, and then this. When you look at particular assets, then this sort of thing often simplifies because various things don't matter. So, for example, external power lines, overhead power lines or externally vulnerable things were not in the pumping, wouldn't affect a pumping station. And so you could forget about those sorts of things and simplify things down. What was happening here was the importance of the backup power. One of the things that was very interesting was associated with we found was about the backup power things is, first of all, they typically weren't renovated very often, weren't kept, so they often didn't work, even though in principle they should have been. And secondly, if you had a flooding incident, often the flood would affect the transformers of the backup. That were so they wouldn't work either. So this was not something that centrally was recorded and wasn't initially communicated with the people that were looking at this stuff. But we began to see this sort of stuff. So the access stuff was critical, and the backup was right. Right, so that is the sort of thing we do. This is why digital twins need statisticians, right? Because we need to build in those probabilities. Once we've got those probabilities in the system, we can then start making this game of a picture and the dynamics of the picture work and calibrate that to the expert judgments about the ways people say things are working, right? You can't just use the ordinary things that people want to give you, like the flooding model people want to give you. You've got to embellish that, right? It's no point just knowing this maximum depth. We've got to know how a particular flood will develop over time in terms of its height, right? And also, how variable the height would be. Otherwise, you can't. You can't do that. You also need to pick out from crisis teams how you deal with these problems. So these subjective expert judgments are critical for three reasons. They certainly give you when you start actually doing these intensive elicitation sessions, you get critical insights about what really is important and what drives this problem, which you would otherwise not see. We learned so much associated with how these things happen, which we just wouldn't see. The information that's recorded there is some systematic information that's recorded, but it's not recorded. It's not recorded centrally, and it's it's really very difficult to get hold of the sort of information that you need, unless you ask experts to synthesize and interpret this stuff. It's meaningless, right? And also, when you're dealing with these extreme incidents, right, it being extreme means to say that you don't have much data direct data associated with these things. Why is it this? Well, firstly, because You've never seen anything quite as extreme as this before. And even if you have, we've only seen one particular instance. So it's only happened once, and then it wasn't a high tide. So you can't just say it will be the same as that, because you need the expert judgment because of that, because you're predicting into a new field, right? So what do we do with this? Well, Kevin and I then reify this thing. And one of the things I would say is that when you're getting this sort of probability model, I would encourage people to look at a specific, make the example that you're looking at as specific as possible, a sort of clarity test on these things. So we looked at a particular pumping station from a particular incident, right? And then we did the elicitation of what would happen with that. If you've got that, then people don't tend to think quite so in quite such a they tend to use their expert judgment rather than think in a formulaic way that they've been told, because they can then start imagining how things are going to be knocking on. So this is what we did, and we got several probabilities. The critical probabilities associated with the CPT associated with the thing. And if you want to hear about what the probabilities, how we elicited those probabilities, then I'm sure Kevin Wilson would love to tell you about all that, right? Because he led that one, and I just was the scribe associated with that. Right? So this is all ongoing work. As you can see, there's a long way to go. But what I would say is that reification here is almost always necessary. You need structural reification to work out what goes on, what the processes are. Use that to get some sort of credence decomposition in terms of the probabilities that you need, then elicit the probabilities associated with that credence decomposition, whether it's a Bayes net or a tree or something like that. And then you've got something which can deal with the joint distributions associated with these big systems, because we can always sample from these probability distributions and produce the outputs that we need, right? So what I would say is reification of digital twins correspond to AI and SEJs forming a beautiful couple. I would encourage, I think this is something that we really, really should be taking on board and trying to lead. And there is, I shared with Tina, there is a very interesting initiative that's happening from Leiden associated with the building up digital twins. And I think we should get in there and start banging the subjective expert judgment drum and say why it's so important that you need to build in these probabilities to this system. Anyway, that's all I've got to say. I've been saying it too long. Goodbye, and thank you very much.